Welcome, everyone. So, I've gotten a lot of questions over the years and the past couple months about the utilization of varying substances while undergoing spiritual awakening. And even utilizing the word, substances can be a little bit loaded, tends to have a little bit of a negative connotation. And so I will start with the caveat that I believe that spiritual awakening should, and I'm very much not a should person, bring somebody to a point where they can employ critical thinking and consider what is best for them. When somebody reaches this point of spiritual awakening, they kind of move past their own moral righteousness and this thought that their own personal thoughts and opinions are what the world should be like. Everybody should follow their morals and understandings of reality. This is a very basic threshold of spiritual awakening that can be seen or not seen in a variety of people. So my basic thought, you do you. But I thought I'd present a nuanced understanding of the utilization of marijuana during spiritual awakening based off of not only my own experience. I feel like I have to say this in the modern day and age because so many people share things in a vacuum. So not only my own experience, but I've been working with people now in some capacity of energy worker, spiritual healer, Chinese medicine practitioner for 20 years now. Actually 21. I sometimes forget what year it is, coming up on 21, and actually over 21. Anyway, forgetting the month and the year for a moment, that over 20 years, and as well as, have certainly had friends, family, all of that sort of stuff share their insights and thoughts about this topic with me. So, what do I want to say about this? The first thing I think is really helpful is to talk about cannabis overall in terms of sort of an herbal monograph. And what that means is talking about its properties. Every single herb, plant, even synthetic product out there has properties that change, shift consciousness and the energetics of the body. In the case of marijuana, it is an herb focused on the fire element. And so, what this means is that in small amounts, what it does is that it stokes the fires of the body, which means that it moves chi, it moves energy through the body. And in doing so, it expands the aura. And so this is why a lot of times people feel really good on it. No matter what strain, what type of, weed you're using, that the effect of it is to have that expansion effect and the cycling of energy through the body effect, particularly of the liver, which has to do in Chinese medicine with things like stress, anger, resentment, sort of all the daily stresses that we experience. And so, what happens with people, depending on what strain that they use, I know it's not as simplistic as saying, um, as sativas sort of uplift your energy or give you more focus, while indicas sort of chill out your energy or cause you to go to sleep. Some of that is a little bit too simplistic. But what I would say is that if we're talking about different strains, we can look at how there is this commonality of expanding the aura, of moving energy through the body, but it will have a spectrum from more sedative, so kind of bringing the energy downward in the body, versus more head-based. So directionality going down versus directionality being around the head and expanding, which would be more sativa, which is why people may smoke something like that and want to go on a hike or have a focus to do a project or plant a garden or whatever, do it, whatever they're doing. And while people smoking the indica, more strains are going to have energy that sort of expands out, but also downward, which is going to cause for them to want to relax and snack and kind of be in front of the TV. So let's talk about snacking for a moment, the infamous stoner munchies. So a lot of us have a lot of stagnant energy in our bodies. And so what happens is that marijuana causes for there to be a cycling of energy. And like I said, an expansion of energy. And so what happens to people who tend to have a lot of stagnant energy in the liver and the digestive tract, which is most people, because we tend to shove a lot of emotions down there, is that it will start moving energies and it will create the illusion of hunger because those areas of the body are no longer quite as stuck. They are moving energy through. And so people will get high and experience this effect of not only energy rapidly cycling through the body, but also a certain degree of heat. And what heat does is, again, moves energy even more rapidly. Um, but depending on how often the person smokes or takes gummies or whatever they're utilizing, that fire spirit can be anything from fairly mild to quite intense. So the milder forms, kind of, people taking gummies, people even doing, vapes and that sort of stuff, that tends to be mild to moderate fire being introduced into the body. If we're talking about the severe end of the spectrum, we are talking about people doing things like ripping bongs, smoking bowls, things where there's direct fire combustion going into the body. That is going to enhance the fiery qualities. And so the fire qualities will not only kind of help to expand and rapidly cycle energy through the body, particularly dealing with frustration, anger, stress, that sort of thing. But the more we go up the fire spectrum, what fire does is it eventually consumes energy. It dries things out. And so this is at the point that people start having what is called yin deficiency, basically the basic fluids of the body, like the fluids in the lungs and also fluids in the digestive tract, start to get consumed by this energy. And so for most people, this isn't an issue if they smoke, a couple times a week or something like that. But the greater they go on the kind of combustion scale, and the more that somebody smokes, the greater fire is going to be present in the body, and it's eventually going to end up being depleting to the system, depleting to the fluids of the system, and depleting to the energy of the system overall. Our bodies are used to being elementally imbalanced. A lot of us are out of balance in a lot of different ways, but um, what smoking does, what ingestion of this fire spirit does, is that it stokes the fires of the body even further. So if you are somebody that is going through the aging process where we naturally lose kind of essence, chi, yin the fluid levels of the body. Um, if you are somebody that tends to be a fiery personality already, your idea of a good Saturday is to jump out of a plane or do something adrenaline sort of induced. Um, the fire element is likely already sort of out of sorts in our bodies. And one of the things that I've found interesting through the years in working with people who utilize all sorts of substances, including people recovering from or in the process of addiction, is that we tend to become addicted to things that exacerbate our imbalances. You would think that we'd be attracted to things that would balance us out. But the person likely reaching for, something like a, indica, and smoking it is likely to be somebody that already maybe has a bit of difficulty getting up off the couch, and may already have significant digestive issues because that is where the fire energy goes. Whether you're ingesting it or smoking it, goes to the lungs and it goes to the large intestine, which are paired in Chinese medicine. So let's now talk about amount of smoking, or amount of ingesting. If you're somebody that's eating a gummy every night to go to sleep or something like that, somebody who's utilizing a small amount to cycle energy through your body, that is going to be much different than somebody who has a picture of always being high. I certainly have met and worked with plenty of people who do experience things, and I know that this is a contentious thing, but I've seen it way too many times over the years, like withdrawal effects if they quit smoking for a few weeks, and emotional effects for even a couple weeks after that. Because, of course, a lot of people utilize cannabis not just as a way to naturally create a calmer, expanded system where energy is cycling through the body, but they are utilizing it as a maladaptive coping mechanism. They are utilizing it to basically sort of blast their aura, their energy field so much that they're no longer present in their bodies anymore. And it is, there definitely is a tipping point to any substance. And yes, people have all the arguments over the years. We can talk about that with sugar and television and gambling and all of these sorts of things. On the grand scheme of things, is cannabis going to have the same withdrawal effects as fentanyl? Or anything like that? Of course not. Is it going to have the same withdrawal effects as benzos? Of course not. But for people that have been smoking every day, all day for years, there is going to be a significant amount of discomfort when they are coming off of, smoking, especially if they go cold turkey. I will also say that we know a lot more now about how people reach a certain tipping point in which it is a coping mechanism for them instead of something that can cycle energy and be utilized as the plant spirit intended. And then there's another tipping point that I've worked with plenty of people with where they've gone into what is now known as, hyperemesis syndrome, where instead of relaxing them, instead of allowing for the digestive system and the liver energy to move, causing effects such as like enhanced creativity, enhanced insight, relaxation of the digestive system, and overall feeling of expansion of ease, maybe even some insight spiritually. Um, they are experiencing the opposite. They're experiencing an extreme clenching of the stomach. Um, the stomach is a little bit to the left of the midline of the solar plexus, so people will start experiencing digestive issues. They'll start experiencing acid reflux. They'll start experiencing vomiting, anxiety, panic attacks, that sort of thing. And that is kind of the severe effects here, but it is helpful to understand because people sometimes are hospitalized for this sort of stuff, and which is unfortunate. And what has happened there is that they have introduced so much of the fire spirit into their body that it has decimated all of the fluids, all of the energy of their digestive system. And the next time that they smoke, there's going to be a clenching, a clamping down, a contraction instead of expansion. This is also the point at which people stop dreaming, you know, that sort of thing, because for most of the spectrum, people may experience enhanced insight, enhanced creativity, enhanced spiritual awareness, maybe even moving through some blocks that they have spiritually. Um, and so what I will say about that is that you're probably sick of hearing me say the word spectrum, but that again is a spectrum. And my caution about that is that frequently the insights that people have from cannabis can range from quite insightful, or that energy, that effect of moving through blocks, cycling energy through the body can be really helpful for stuck areas, enhance dreams, enhance communion with the spirit realms, enhance awareness of what is already around them spiritually that maybe they wouldn't have without being high. That are kind of, under the positive effects here. And so what I will say though is that that can go into the severe end that I mentioned, where people stop dreaming and, that sort of thing. But I have seen a number of clients who, again, are kind of going into their imbalances, where they are ungrounded and all of their energy is kind of already in their head or outside of their body totally. And so what happens when they're smoking is that they are escaping what little tent hold, whatever little small sort of foothold into their body they have overall. And so what that means is that the insights that they are receiving are not very grounded. So not very, useful, practical part of this reality, sort of embodied, all of those sort of words that can happen when we receive spiritual insight, and then we can kind of sit with it for a while and sort of digest it for a while. We don't tend to do this, or don't tend to do this beyond a certain point with when we smoke or otherwise uh, take in marijuana. So let's sum up, and I'll talk about a couple other things. To sum up, cannabis, marijuana can be utilized in a way that is in line with its spirit, in line with what you'd see on a herbal monograph regarding it, what its clinical herbal healing properties are. If somebody has cancer or nausea or difficulty eating, with a fair amount of people with eating disorders, stuff like that, like, or just, I've worked with, elderly patients that have difficulty getting to sleep, or a lot of people have difficulty getting to sleep. Do I personally think that it is a bad thing for most of that population to, eat a gummy before bed or smoke a little weed? Of course not. When we start going into people utilizing it on a regular basis, though, there can be a question of if they are in line with the spirit of this. All plants, all substances, everything we take in has a spirit to it. And somebody abusing that spirit, somebody not in line with the spirit of cannabis, is going to be utilizing it as a numbing agent, as an escape agent, um, rather than something that is meant to help, move some stagnant energy through their body. This is how people come to insights, by the way, is that most of us have stuck liver energy in our body. Our liver energy and the spirit of the liver in Chinese medicine very much has to do with our creativity. And so if a bunch of stuck energy moves, we suddenly have capacity to, think of songs, writings, all of that sort of dance, all of that sort of stuff. Um, it is just a question, again, if we're going to moderate and going up the spectrum, is somebody kind of going off the cliff there where they are getting to a point where they have expanded their aura to the extent that they have essentially escaped their bodies. In which case, if they are not present in their body very much, what is going to happen is that that insight isn't going to be, a part of sort of this reality or likely very helpful. So there is a lot of discernment here with, people who, and there are people who sort of imbibe, so to speak. And the other thing that I would say is that there's sort of a trope of people, thinking they come up with the answers to the universe when they're high. And then they come out of that state and realize, like, oh, maybe that wasn't that insightful. So we can take that that trope in hand a little bit, and think about that a little bit, if we do utilize cannabis. So the last thing that I will share is about the energetics of cannabis a little bit further from a spiritual perspective. I talked about how spiritually what happens is that there's a cycling of energy energetically through the body, but there's also this expansion of the aura. What can happen is that if we go through a certain threshold, like basically go past a certain tipping point, and that tipping point is going to be different for everyone. Somebody who is really grounded in their body, who smokes, that tipping point might be a much further place than somebody who is completely outside of their body. Because what happens with the aura with cannabis over time past that tipping point is that it goes beyond expansion into sort of disintegrating. And so what happens to those people is a couple of things. Um, is that they no longer, our auras are our ego, they're our identity, they are our best defense mechanism. And so when that mechanism, that sort of, our aura, that sort of egg around us expands too far, that it starts to, the threads start to sort of disintegrate, they create openings, which creates difficulties in keeping other people's stuff out. And also on a personal level, having a sense of identity, and this is me, and that is you, that sort of thing. I will also say in the extreme, I will say that this is extreme, but I've worked with it plenty of times, is that when people are smoking, they don't necessarily or are taking in cannabis in some way. I don't mean to leave out edibles. I'm just like kind of an old school person. So some of the like Delta 8 and all that sort of stuff is a little bit new hat to me. But I will say that smoking certainly is not. There's, the Willie Nelson joke of like, when I grew up, a dime bag was a dime, sort of thing. I'm not quite there, but I will say that this goes for basically all forms of cannabis that has the same properties, just in slightly different sort of percentages, for that fire aspect of it. So I will mention two last things. And one is that when people are already kind of distanced from their body, they're sort of head in the clouds sort of people. They tend to think really abstractly, not pragmatically. They have difficulty connecting to people because they're kind of like up here. What tends to happen is that there are certainly other substances that I can talk about, like ayahuasca, MDMA, where this happens much more frequently. But somebody can get kind of lost a bit, have aspects of their soul go somewhere else when high. This doesn't happen. Again, I've worked with it much more with things like ayahuasca, LSD, MDMA, stuff like that. But heroin, things like that. But it is a possibility for there to be a need for soul retrieval. And maybe I'll do a different video on that. But for somebody to actually track what sort of realm, plane of reality, an aspect of their soul kind of ended up lost in, and to bring it back. Usually, the times that I've had to do this for people who have utilized cannabis, or people who are kind of the daily smokers, people with a significant trauma background, um, and people who are just really sensitive overall. Um, Whereas they say things like every time, ever since I smoked, or from that period of time, like I feel like a part of myself is just sort of drifty or off, or something like that. And that would necessitate a need for somebody to go, a spiritual worker to go and find that aspect of them and bring it back to their energy field. Again, I can do a different recording about soul retrieval, but it's a bit different than is popularly talked about. What's popularly talked about is typically aspects of self that are still present in the energy field. This is different. In this case, somebody has utilized a substance and they were already had kind of a not so great of a tether to their physical body, and so an aspect of them sort of got lost in, you know, a lot of different spaces that aspects of us can sort of get lost in. The last thing that I will mention is that we tend to live in a very puritanical culture. So there is kind of a nuanced understanding of things, is that you can get to a point spiritually where your interest in changing your consciousness sort of ends. You just don't need to have any interest in doing so anymore. Um, that sort of thing. That being said, we live in a very puritanical culture, and a lot of times people don't realize that a shift in consciousness can be helpful, and that there are all sorts of people, spiritual people out there who are not perfect. They, they smoke, they drink, they utilize all sorts of substances, especially if you look at shamans and shamanic culture, but really monks having beer, all of that sort of stuff. Like, we come from a very puritanical culture in which we very much chastise anybody who isn't, a breatharian, where they're no longer eating or taking anything in and is completely and totally perfect. There's a lot I could go into spiritually there, but I will say that there is a balance and perspective in the fact that yes, you can reach a certain point in which you have no interest in shifting your consciousness anymore, and you are no longer reaching for things that are kind of those coping mechanisms anymore, because you've healed that stuff within. You don't need to, you know, um, you don't need to do that anymore. Um, but there's also this very heavy, like, sort of unfortunate culture that chastises people for utilizing substances that can be really helpful, that do have a place, that do have a purpose. And so the last thing that I will say is that there are plenty of ways shamanically, energetically, or simply by expressing gratitude, connecting to the spirit of the plant, that we can be connected spiritually to what we are taking into our bodies on a deeper level. And that changes the relationship significantly. For example, I've worked with plenty of addicts who've done, for example, shamanic journeying or just meditation to meet the spirit of the cannabis plant, and they've realized that they've been out of sync with it, that they've abused it, that here is this beautiful structure, this beautiful being, and they are not there. They have had a blind eye or, blind ear to the lessons, the teachings of that plant. And that can very much shift their consciousness as well as their consumption habits. So, ending thought, honor whatever you are taking into your body. Consider it as a form of consciousness. Consider how it shifts your consciousness. And if you are one of those people that is taking in too much fire, utilizing it as a coping mechanism instead of something to help support things, seek out some help, seek out some healing, because there's a reason that we all turn towards coping mechanisms at times. They're nothing to be ashamed of, but they are something that can be worked with. Last thing I will mention, I promise, it is about Kundalini and marijuana. I will say that for some people, Kundalini, cannabis stokes the fires of Kundalini. A lot of people going through Kundalini awakening are in the first stage where they're experiencing a lot of fire, and cannabis sort of inflames that fire, which can be helpful for some people to break through some blockages, and for other people, it can be a bit too much. I will also say that I have encountered a fair number of people who believe that they're undergoing a Kundalini awakening, and what is happening instead is that they are smoking so much pot, they are taking so many edibles, whatever their deal is. They are high all the time to the point that what is happening is that they are just introducing a lot of fire into their body, and it doesn't have anything to do with Kundalini awakening. And what will happen, the difference between those is that somebody experiencing Kundalini awakening is going to have an experience in an embodied consciousness, in which they become more emotionally balanced, more sane, more aware of themselves and other people. And people who believe that they are experiencing a Kundalini awakening when they are just really, really high all of the time, typically don't have that awareness of other people and are not experiencing that sort of gradual unfolding of consciousness where they feel more connected, more grounded, more embodied within themselves and to the world. So I hope that this has been helpful and interesting for you. I know that this is a contentious topic for many, and so I will leave by saying that I present all of this not only because y'all asked for it, but also that I always put out whatever I'm saying, not because, I want for you to take it on directly, but to provide thoughts for your own critical thinking, for your own personal relationship with cannabis, for what is right for you. And that very much, that individuation process, that consideration of what is right for you as an individual, rather than what society thinks, what your parents think, what you grew up learning about it, what advertisements thinks, I think is a big part of spiritual awakening.